Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to this Wednesday seminar on US-China relations under Biden administration, implications for India. As you know, later today, Joe Biden will be sworn in as the 46th US president. So transition will be completed. The topic we have selected for today is one of the most important questions being debated. And to explore this subject, we have with us two very distinguished speakers, Ambassador Arun Singh, former Ambassador of India to the USA, France, and Israel, who is now teaching at Ashok University among his other affiliations. We also have Ananth Krishnan, China correspondent of The Hindu. Welcome, Arun. Welcome, Ananth.
Thank you.
We have ThePrint as a media partner for this seminar. There are several strands in Chinese thinking that we can discern from our interactions with the Chinese strategic community and commentaries emanating from China. There is a measure of consensus that China's relations with the USA have changed fundamentally under the Trump administration, and that under Biden too, strategic competition rivalry will continue. There is in fact no real expectation of return to amicable engagement with an element of competition that characterized Sino-US relations under the Obama administration. There are some who argue that USA will be preoccupied with the COVID pandemic and domestic differences, including polarization that Arun referred to in a very perceptive op-ed piece in Indian Express this morning. It suggested that there'll be only limited appetite in view of these preoccupations to wage an aggressive strategic offensive vis-a-vis China. However, there is recognition in China that Trump's policy of treating China as a strategic rival, which needs to be countered and contained, has bipartisan support, including in the US Congress, and is likely to outlast Trump. In his confirmation hearing yesterday, Secretary of State designate Antony Blinken agreed with GOP senators that previous optimistic approaches to China were flawed and backed the tougher approach adopted by the Trump administration. He also supported his predecessor or the current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo's finding that China has committed genocide in Xinjiang. He used, in fact, on China language and formulations quite tough in character. At the same time, there is a view both in China as also in the USA that the US under Biden will be less confrontational and unpredictable compared to the Trump period when it comes to China policy. It's being hoped in China that Biden will be more inclined to explore areas of convergent interests like climate change, as Blinken also suggested yesterday in his congressional testimony. There is nevertheless apprehension in China that Biden might be more effective in countering China as he eschews Trump's unilateral policies, which targeted US allies as well, and instead work with allies and develop coherent coalitions targeting China. Implications or indications are that China might seek to dial down tensions in its relations without in any way lowering its strategic ambitions. This afternoon, our speakers will be exploring several questions. Let me highlight the three set of questions that I believe Arun and Ananth will be addressing. One, would a Biden administration build further on the Trump era characterization of China as a rival and a challenge? Or would it be conditioned more by the search for common ground on climate change, arms control, and global economic revitalization? Or would it be a mix of the two? This is first set of questions. Secondly, how is China viewing the change in the USA? Does China expect an easing of the tensions that marked relations with the Trump administration? Or is it preparing for the prospect of a more effective American response predicated on a more coherent strategy involving US allies and partners? Thirdly, what impact will the changing US-China dynamic have on India-China relations at a time when numerous commentators in China are situating recent tensions with India against the backdrop of a closer India-US strategic partnership? Before I invite Arun and Ananth to speak and address these questions, let me explain some ground rules. Arun and Ananth have indicated that they'll be speaking for about 35, 40 minutes, when we'll mute all other participants. We'll thereafter have the Q&A session for about 30 minutes. You may indicate your interest in asking questions by using the raise hand option available at the bottom of the list of participants. Questions can also be sent to me through the chat option. I'll call on the participants to ask their questions. The concerned participant will unmute himself or herself. Other participants are requested to keep themselves muted. I'll now invite Ambassador Arun Singh to offer his remarks. Arun is one of our most perceptive observers of the issues relating to USA, and we are all looking forward to hearing Arun's views on US-China relations and the Biden presidency. Arun, over to you.
Thank you, Ashok. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion and for your very comprehensive introduction. I must congratulate you for the timing of your selection for this discussion, because as you mentioned, Joe Biden takes over later today as the 46th president. But even more than that, so far, many of us were speculating, writing on what a Biden administration would mean for US-China relation and therefore implications for India. And much of that, to some extent, was based on informed analysis, some speculation, going by our interactions by officials in the Obama-Biden administration, who we expected to be there as part of the Biden-Harris administration, going by analysis of what they have been writing since and commenting. But as you indicated, yesterday, many of them took formal positions as part of the Senate confirmations, and therefore the manner in which they will navigate the new phase in the relationship with China, at least as of now, there was some indication. And if you looked at the comments of not just the Secretary of State designate Blinken, but also the Defense Secretary designate Austin, the Director of National Intelligence designate Avril Haines, the broad message that came out related to China is that they see China as a very important rival. Perhaps they see China as the principal rival going ahead, because Austin characterized Russia as declining in its ability to challenge the United States and can still challenge militarily, not in other domains, but China having the capacity and increasing capacity to challenge the United States across a range of sectors. China's model was described as authoritarian, the challenge to US values. And as you mentioned, the designation by Pompeo of Chinese actions in Xinjiang as genocide was supported by Blinken. But way back in August, when a similar question had been posed to candidate Biden, when there were some reports that this designation was being considered, through a spokesman, he had indicated that he would support this designation. And Avril Haines, in her testimony, said that the way they handled China pre-Trump was based on situation then. The situation now is very, very different. And in her testimony, the Treasury Secretary designate Janet Yellen described Chinese economic practices in very negative terms. Predatory economic practices, intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers. So it's a new approach if we compare it to the time of the Obama-Biden administration. Now, will this endure? Is this just the initial phase? What will be the difference between the Trump approach and the Biden approach? I think we can understand that if we look at the evolution of the US-China relationship in a more historical context, and then see what the Trump administration did, and therefore what are going to be the compulsions for the Biden administration. Now, we all recall that the new phase, in a sense, of the relationship with China was started way back in 1971, when Henry Kissinger made a secret trip through Pakistan. Before that, he came to India, didn't say anything, and suddenly vanished while he was in Pakistan. And that was a part of their attempt to sharpen the Sino-Soviet split in the global balance of power. And during the 1971 conflict that we had with Pakistan, in terms of Kissinger's memoirs and the declassified documents, it is clear that one of the reasons they came down completely on support of Pakistan was because they wanted to signal to China that as you build this new relationship with the United States, you will find the United States stands with his partners and allies. And so that was one of the dimensions that had come in. 1971 onwards, the new phase of engagement with China started for the US. In 1989, when the Tiananmen incident happened, the United States, despite the gross violation of human rights, looked at the broader dimension of the relationship. There were some minor sanctions, but the approach of engagement with China was sustained. After a while, the US worked for China's entry into World Trade Organization and worked to grant China permanent normal trading relations status, which was something earlier was being done on an annual basis as a way of sustaining pressure on China related to some of its domestic policies, economic policies, issues related to human rights. But once the permanent normal trading relations status was given, that pressure went off. Of course, this was supported by US business, which wanted a more predictable regime in the relationship with China. You may recall the then US Vice President, Mondale, during a visit to China in 1979, said that the rise of China is in US interest. Now, this is a language that the US uses very often related to India. Now, in 1984, President Reagan issued the National Security Decision Directive 120, just before the visit of Chinese Prime Minister Zhao Ziyang. And in that, it was said that the US seeks a strong, secure, and stable China that can be an increasing force for peace, both in Asia and the world. In 1979, when Deng Xiaoping had visited the US, the two agreed to establish a joint intelligence station in northwest China. It was called Operation Chestnut, and part of the idea was to keep an eye on the Soviet Union. In 1981, President Reagan allowed sale of air, ground, naval, and missile technology to China. At that time, technology transfers to China were given on generous terms. China was given preferential trade and investment access. Vast educational exchanges were promoted. And currently, there are more than 400,000 Chinese students in the United States. 1/3 of all foreign students in the US is Chinese. And that, of course, generates a certain pressure on the US educational system, which is looking at sources of funding for themselves. And as everyone knows, China has used this access to pick up technology and other aspects of information from the US system. The United States also supported at that time development financing for China through the World Bank, through the Asian Development Bank. And starting 1981, China started getting those loans. And as of today, China has got more than $60 billion worth of loans from multilateral financing institutions. In 1981, Reagan also authorized peaceful nuclear cooperation to boost China's civil nuclear program. He loosened in 83 control on export of technology to China. In 1986, they authorized the establishment of research efforts in many cutting-edge areas. That year, the US also started something called the Peace Pearl program to modernize China's F-8 jet fighters. So that was the broad approach to China at that time. Now, it gradually began to change from the time of the Bush administration. Because even during the Clinton administration, the attempt was to involve China more and more into what was described as the international mainstream. And as you know, Clinton had worked for China's entry in the WTO. And the whole argument was that engagement would lead to political and economic liberalization in China. You may have noticed that in the hearing that was done for the Director of National Intelligence yesterday, the ranking member in the Senate, who will now become chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mark Warner, said that he was one of those who had argued that engagement would lead to liberalization, but that he has now realized that that was a mistake and that the US now needs to follow a broad policy. So from the time of the Bush administration, there was a gradual sense that China was emerging as a challenge, but still not a complete change in policy or approach. And a leading member of the Bush administration at that time, Bob Zoellick, for example, put it in terms of they would like China to have a responsible stakeholder approach, taking into account China's growing power and its desire for a greater international role, while deflecting Chinese pressure to replace the US-led international system. So still an effort to cooperate, to accommodate, but try and maintain the US primacy. The Obama administration, when it came in, again started with mixed signals. In the beginning, the messaging was, including in various private conversations, that they would want to give strategic reassurance to China, that the US believed that it can accommodate in a harmonious manner the rise of China. The two countries could take care of each other's interests, and it could be a cooperative relationship. In 2009, for example, President Bush had visited China, and in the joint statement that was issued, there was a reference to the two countries also working together in South Asia. Now, that's something that was completely not acceptable to India. However, since then, there has been no such reference in any US-China joint statement of working together in South Asia. But in that joint statement, there was also a reference that each would be sensitive, both countries would be sensitive to each other's core interests, and on that basis, they could build a stable relationship. Similar sentiments were also expressed when Chinese President Hu Jintao visited the United States in 1981. But by the second phase of the Obama administration, I think the terminology began to change. They began to see China as less cooperative, more a threat to themselves. And the concept that was articulated was that the US now needed to do a pivot to Asia. And therefore, that the US needed to remove some of its resources from Europe, from West Asia, and focus its efforts in the Indo-Pacific theater, not to contain China, but as the argument was done in the US, to shape the environment around the rise of China, so that the countries in the region, in ASEAN, South Asia, had options other than giving in to Chinese preferences and pressures. So that was the argument that was put forward. Then there was a reaction that pivot was too strong a word. We don't want to signal to China that we are taking them on as a rival, as an enemy, that while we want to sort of shape the environment, there is scope for cooperation. So the word that was used was rebalance, that there would be a rebalance to Asia. And although they took some measures in terms of bringing new arrangements for their military to access Australia, some facilities in Philippines, the kind of response that they wanted to take, they were not able to take because of their continued involvement and focus in Europe, because there they saw challenge from Russia in the context of Georgia, in the context of Ukraine, and continued instability and challenges in West Asia. So that was something that was not carried out. And again, when China militarized the features in South China Sea, the US did not come forward with any effective response. And allies and partners of the United States, of course, noticed that. For example, on Senkaku also, while the US said that it stood by its obligation to Japan in the context of defense arrangements, it did not support Japan's claim on Senkaku itself. Similarly, it did not support Philippines' claim on Scarborough. And in response to Chinese militarization in South China Sea, the entire effort from the Obama administration was only to enforce freedom of navigation and not really push back on what China had done. And when the question was asked with senior officials in the US administration, that can you enforce freedom of navigation in a medium and longer term context if Chinese physical presence is built up in that area? To that, they really didn't have a response, but that was where they had limited what they were going to do. It was in that background that the Trump administration came in. And if you notice, in the first phase of the Trump administration, really till the end of 2017, there was a bit of flip-flop in the approach to China. During the campaign, Trump had repeatedly said that he would take strong action against China, that he would try and reduce the trade imbalance with China, he would raise tariffs on supplies from China, he would declare China as a currency manipulator on day one, which is something they didn't do then, they did a little later for a while. But once he came into administration, the message was that he could build a new relationship with President Xi. He could have elements of cooperation, also in the context of North Korea. He invited Xi to Mar-a-Lago. He visited China towards the end of that year. But by December 2017, I think they assessed that the kind of cooperation they wanted from China, they were not getting. Their political requirements related to trade were not being met. And so in the national security strategy that came out in December 17, for the first time, it was said clearly that China was a strategic rival, and it was among the main global competitors of and rivals of the US, along with Russia. And then, of course, they went on to mention Iran, North Korea, and the challenge related to non-state actors and terrorism. This articulation was followed by subsequent US policy documents, the National Defense Strategy, early in 2018, the Nuclear Posture Review. Since that time, I think there has been a consistent, what one can call, whole of government approach in the US, classifying China differently. There were statements by the Secretary of State on a number of occasions, the Vice President, the National Security Advisor, the Director FBI, Attorney General, everyone consistently projecting that China was a main rival, that Chinese authoritarian system was a challenge to the US-led democratic framework, and that this was a challenge that the United States needed to meet. Aside from the whole of government approach, there was also an attempt of what I described in the piece today as a whole of society approach, that they realized that through the period of engagement with China, there were now different stakeholders in the US system were heavily invested in the China relationship. The US educational institution, the regional administration, US businesses. So consistently, there were messages directed, focused at the US universities, the governors, the US business, that you need to change how you are engaging with China. Because the Chinese practices are a long-term challenge to the United States. And of course, there were elements in the US administration who were not quite in sync with this. According to reports, Jared Kushner, the advisor and son-in-law of President Trump, supported continued engagement with China, as did Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. Henry Kissinger was widely reported as among those heavily involved in behind the scenes lobbying to keep the process with China going as it was in the past. But broadly, this was the attempt. And it was in this background that a series of measures were taken which were unprecedented. The sanctions were imposed on Chinese technology companies to prevent access to technology, Huawei, ZTE. Sanctions were imposed on Chinese companies linked to the military, because there was an argument that there is civil-military fusion in China, and therefore even civilian companies in China having access to high technology then feeds into the Chinese military, which is a challenge to the United States. And that the state-owned enterprises are heavily entwined with the Chinese state and system, and therefore they needed to be handled differently. There were sanctions imposed on Chinese companies that were involved in construction activity in South China Sea, sanctions on individuals involved in what were described as human rights violations in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, and now, of course, declaring what has happened in Xinjiang. as a genocide. And then now preventing many Chinese companies from becoming part of stock indices so that there is no automatic flow of funds to those companies, and many from being listed on the various stock exchanges in the United States. So a whole series of steps were now taken against China, which is very different. And I think when you spoke to policymakers, analysts, and others in the US, the argument was that it is not so much the United States that has changed, but that China has changed. That under President Xi, China has taken a different path. The hide and bide policy of Deng has been given up. China is asserting itself. It is becoming unilateral in its assertions, in its preferences. It is the China dream and others. So with that, US interests are being directly challenged, and therefore the US has no option but to respond to this. Now, in that framework, I think China in the United States has become a major political issue. Many of those who are going to be campaigning in 2024 for the president's post, and in the US, as you know, before you finish one election, the campaign for the next one begins, will be marketing themselves based on a hawkish China policy. And if Trump is able to come back to campaign in 2024, that will certainly be an argument. But somebody like Pompeo, if you see the manner in which he has built up his profile as a China hawk, is something that he will use, aside from the other elements he has built in terms of issues related to religious freedom, issues related to Israel. So that will be something that he will be using. And therefore, for Democrats, it is important at this stage to signal that they are no less hawkish on China than what was there in the Trump administration. Furthermore, Biden will need a measure of bipartisan consensus in the US Congress, both in the House and the Senate, where in the Senate it's a one-seat margin, in the House also a reduced margin, although they are in a majority. So he needs some bipartisan consensus to get through the House and Senate measures that he wants related to the economy, related to infrastructure construction, related to stimulus. And for that, China will be an important peg, that we need to compete with China. China is a rival for the United States, and we need to work keeping that in mind. That again will generate some compulsion to retain the strong posture and hawkish posture related to China. So given this, and the fact that a Biden administration would like to signal that they are different from the Trump administration and that they are more effective than the Trump administration, I think what they will do is perhaps the rhetoric will come down. The unpredictability also will come down. They would want to work, at least show that they're working more with their allies and partners, which may temper some of the more harsh measures they want to do, especially if they want to carry Europe with them. Because as many have described, Europe doesn't really have a consolidated China policy. And there are differences in approach there. Germany is heavily invested in China. 5 million German cars are sold to China every year, 1 million to the United States. Public opinion polls suggest in Germany that as many Germans believe China to be the most important relationship as the United States. So China has made inroads in Europe. And recently, the European Union and China have done the investment agreement. So that might generate some constraint on the administration in terms of what they want to do. But of course, they're able to bring their allies with them. They would be more effective in their approach. So given that, I think as far as the implications for India are concerned, the US and Tony Blinken has mentioned that in the hearing. He's also mentioned it in an important discussion he did at the Hudson Institute in 2020, that the United States will continue to build the relationship with India as a major defense partner and sees India as a stabilizing force in the region, and that a very important strategic partnership to build going ahead. So let me stop here, Ashok, and if there are any issues I've left out, I'd be happy to pick on that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun, for that. Very perceptive and comprehensive elaboration on how US-China relations have developed over the years. I think it's very important to remember and keep in mind the context and historical background of evolution of this relationship. How, for an extended period, USA was supportive of the rise of China, and gradually this concerns developed and this view became preponderant in the US system that China is a challenge rather than an advantage when it comes to US position in the world. You also brought out the changes that occurred during Trump presidency and how it's your expectation that due to a variety of reasons in Biden administration, two relatively hawkish postures vis-a-vis China will continue. And you have brought out some very important implications that evolving US-China relations have for India and our own interests. Thanks for that presentation. I'll now turn to our second speaker, Ananth Krishnan, China correspondent to Hindu. Ananth, as you know, has an outstanding track record of reporting from China for nearly a decade for the Hindu and India Today. He has recently published an excellent book, India's China Challenge, which we had discussed at this forum a few weeks ago. So Ananth, over to you. Ananth will be talking about how China is looking at Sino-US relations and some of the implications that this relationship has for India-China relations. Ananth, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kantha and Ambassador Singh. I think I learned a lot from what you just said. What I thought I would do is try and present some of the perspectives that we've been seeing from China, from its officials, its strategic community and state media over the past few days and weeks. I think Ambassador Kantha pretty much summed it up in 2 sentences at the introduction, which is an expectation that if things may be somewhat smoother and the relationship might be more institutional or through institutional channels, slightly more predictable, there are still longer term trends that aren't related to Trump or one party in the US, and that there's a bipartisan consensus in America. I think that people in China aren't in denial about that, but I thought it'll be useful to just tease out some of the more interesting, colorful views that have come out in the Chinese press over the last few weeks. And also, of course, try and, towards the end, make sense of how China views relations with India at the moment and how it fits into all of this. I thought I would begin by flagging your attention to 2 recent commentaries out in the past week that were issued by Xinhua News Agency, which is the most official, authoritative news outlet that you have in China. These were both first issued in Mandarin and then in English, and were quite widely published across different Chinese media outlets. Xinhua doesn't often issue commentaries, and usually those that it does are op-eds by writers. Both of these commentaries didn't have bylines. Well, one didn't have a byline, the other had a pseudonym. And what I found interesting was some of the talking points that they mentioned have been sort of repeated by the Chinese Foreign Ministry all of this week, leaving one to conclude that this is a message from fairly high up within the system. The first commentary was simply headlined, "Good riddance, Mr. Trump." Its first sentence read, speaking about one of the many end-of-term moves that we have seen, in this case, the sanctioning of 6 Chinese officials over Hong Kong. It called it the final scene of a preposterous show, and saying that there was no limit on the ignorance and prejudice of the Trump administration in looking to contain China's development. It went on to say that Trump's trade war had failed to boost the US economy, had hurt the US economy, and as well as job losses in the US. And it pretty much said that, in their view, the US had, quote, clearly overestimated its ability to influence the course of the relationship. It interestingly ended with an olive branch, presumably to the next administration, saying that both sides were actually in a good position to help each other succeed and cooperate in a lot of areas, starting with the COVID-19 pandemic climate change, and the threat of nuclear proliferation, three issues that were highlighted quite clearly. And then it concluded, quote, "Good riddance to the current administration and its final madness." The second longer commentary was somewhat more measured, saying that the relationship now, quote, "stood at a crossroads, fraught with risks and challenges as well as opportunities." I'd look back on the 50th anniversary of Kissinger's trip to China, and it noted how trade had grown in excess of $500 billion, and that there were something like 72,000 US companies that were based in China with assets exceeding 700 billion US dollars. It noted that, however, the past 4 years, in their view, were the most difficult period since the establishment of diplomatic relations. And this they attributed to, quote, "extreme anti-China forces in the US." Referring to the Trump administration, it accused them of deliberately negating the history of bilateral relations and maliciously attacking the Communist Party of China. Their main grouse was the move towards decoupling between the two economies and, in their view, coercing other countries into containing and confronting China in an attempt to create, quote, "parallel worlds or two systems." I thought it was quite interesting that it said that if the relationship had to return to some kind of normalcy or some track of engagement, that it laid down what would be a fundamental principle and a bottom line. Now, this fundamental principle, in their view, and this is the Xinhua view, and as I said, there is reason to conclude this came from somewhere fairly high up within the system, was that to acknowledge both sides followed different social political systems, to acknowledge that China had no intention of changing the US or replacing it, while the US should at the same time abandon its wishful thinking of changing China. The bottom line from China's view was the US should acknowledge that the CPC is the ruling party of China. And it said that it did make an interesting proposal that both sides and the new administration should begin working on what it called the cooperation framework. It said that this framework could not be agreed on overnight, but it could focus on three areas, which it described as COVID-19, climate change, as well as stabilizing economic and trade relations. It's also interesting that a lot of Chinese commentators have noted that where China might have some leverage is in the Biden administration's emphasis on climate change. He has said that he would return to the Paris Agreement on day one. In addition to climate change, they look at the Iranian nuclear issue and the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue as two other areas where they feel that if the US wants to adopt a different approach, it will need China. And so this is going to result in at least three areas where both will at least have some dialogue, as opposed to the last 2-3 years where there was an almost complete breakdown. So you see sort of the outlines of talking points emerging as the administration changes, and Foreign Minister Wang Yi made pretty much the exact same points in an interview with the Chinese state media right after the new year. So what he said was, he did make the same point that the relationship was facing its biggest challenge since the normalization of ties. And he said, obviously, quote, "it all comes down to the misconceptions of US policymakers about China." So there is some mirror imaging here. Ambassador Singh said the view in the US is the US approach hadn't changed, but China under Xi had changed. Well, here they're pretty much saying the exact same thing, that it was a change in US attitudes to China that had led to what has happened over the last 4 years. And in their view, this is Wang Yi's view, it was the US attempt to suppress China's rise and start a new Cold War that was at the root of the tensions. Wang Yi also did offer an olive branch, saying that relations are now at a crossroads, and in his view, quote, "there was a new window of hope." He said that China hoped the next administration would return to, quote, "a sensible approach and resume dialogue." But of course, left unsaid is what China would agree. And so far, what they've been saying so far is that one party that was responsible for all the problems should be the one to fix it. And the Chinese saying that's been quoted a lot in the last few weeks is that he who ties the knot should undo the knot. So they made it very clear that they don't feel they have any responsibility in all of this. I think that The immediate challenge, obviously, that the relationship faces in the view of these voices in Beijing is that the Biden administration has a lot of things that it has to undo. The US website Axios yesterday had an excellent piece where it had actually noted every single action taken by the Trump administration aimed at China. They listed 210 public actions related to China, spanning 10 US departments. This is far beyond just State Department and Department of Defense. And this is what they called a, quote, whole of government strategy. I think this was before the listing of genocide in Xinjiang, which would make it 211 actions. I don't think there's an expectation in China that a Biden administration would overturn all of these, or even that he chooses to. But there is an expectation that that he has to at least take actions on some of these to show his goodwill. Whether that happens or not remains to be seen. As Ambassador Singh said, I think a lot of the members of Team Biden taking shape have made it clear that this isn't going to be a return to Obama 1. This is not going to be an Obama 2.0, and that they do agree with many of the fundamental premises of how Trump viewed China as the biggest strategic challenge. A few views that I thought I would share over the last couple of weeks. Diao Daming, who is a China-US expert at Renmin University in Beijing, I think shared what I think is the common view that Democrats have also accepted, in his words, the fundamental stance of great power competition laid by the Republicans. So in his view, they can only make tactical level adjustments and the basic course of relations would not change. His concern, and the concern of many others in Beijing, is that the Democrats would be more effective in, quote, pressuring China through multilateral approaches, working more closely with US allies, and being more concerned about ideological differences in human rights on Xinjiang, on Tibet, and Hong Kong, where the Democratic Party has been outspoken. Joe Biden was ahead of the Trump administration as a candidate. He said what was happening in Xinjiang was genocide. And so they feel that, and obviously, even if the US State Department under Trump was outspoken on Xinjiang, it's been documented that Mr. Trump himself praised what China was doing in Xinjiang to President Xi and said that they should continue what they were doing. They are also concerned that Biden could revive Obama's legacy on trade, on a return to multilateral trading arrangements, which they feel would hurt China's interests. I think the view was summed up quite nicely by Li Haidong, who is a professor in China Foreign Affairs University. He said that Biden is, quote, definitely smoother to deal with. And so China can expect smoother communication and more effective communication. But it remains to be seen, in his view, if Biden will choose to fix the damage caused by Trump. But at the very least, they would have more reason to dialogue and cooperate, at least on climate change, Iran, and North Korea. At the same time, the view that he outlines, which is, I think, a very common view in China right now, is that China should insist to its non-negotiable bottom line when it comes to US interference in its internal affairs. And that should be a fundamental point. If they're looking to rebuild the relationship, that is what it should be rebuilt on, in the Chinese view. That was also a point made by Xi Jinping recently on the anniversary of the Korean War. He did not name the US, but he did say that China was now in a position where it would fight back and the Chinese people would not be trifled with. So that's the mood right now. And I don't think that's going to change regardless of who is in the White House. I will wrap up with this interesting observation from Wei Zhongyu at Fudan, who had an essay on 3 things that will change and 3 things that will not change and 4 things that will. The 3 things that will not change, in his view, is the tough on China rhetoric, which in his view is the new political correctness in the United States. And in his view, no one wants to be seen as being soft on China, and they would risk losing public support. The second thing that wouldn't change is the partial technological decoupling that would continue, as well as the difficult environment for Chinese firms in the US. Third, they would expect a continued toughness from America on human rights, and possibly more so, including, in his view, an international united front against China on democracy and human rights issues. I think the Biden administration has said that they are going to organize a global conference on democracy. 4 things that could change. The first is he feels that, unlike the Republican Party, the Democrats haven't really fleshed out what the China challenge is. They think that, in his view, they don't think the China challenge is primarily a military one. Second, they think his approach will be different, and in some ways could be more effective than Trump, because he would engage with China without resorting to, quote, self-defeating unilateral actions. I think the third area where they feel change is improvement when it comes to bilateral, cultural, people-to-people exchanges that have come to a near halt. The Trump administration has cracked down on Chinese students, on Chinese journalists, and they believe that at least some of those traditional forms of engagement will continue. And lastly, they feel that there will be opportunity to cooperate on global issues beyond the bilateral, like climate change and non-proliferation. So I think a common theme. I think one final note, I think when we focus on the bilateral calculus and all the damage that China has, all the hurt that the Chinese economy has faced under Donald Trump, one thing that hasn't been lost on the Chinese state media is Trump has been at least one kind of a gift in terms of a propaganda gift, which is why that one of the nicknames that you see in the Chinese media is referring to Trump as Chuan Chengguo, meaning Trump who builds China. The argument being that a divided America was good for China. It was not a great advertisement for a democratic political system. This was a point that has been milked ceaselessly by the Communist Party's propaganda outfits. And that's something that clearly China is going to miss when they deal with the next administration. A final few thoughts on observations on the China-India front. I think I'll leave this as a few observations that perhaps we can discuss as a Q&A. So the conventional wisdom, I think, prior to 2020 was that with Trump, with rising US-China tensions, all this would be good for India. There would be greater space for India. And the thinking was that this would incentivize China to keep relations with India stable. If we go back to 2017 and 2018, I was looking back at some of the briefings we had back then with Indian and Chinese officials. And this was the background to everything that happened in the lead up to the Wuhan summit. You had this new phrase in the relationship was that India and China could be, quote, a factor of stability. The relationship could be a factor of stability. All this was a nod, of course, to Trump and the instability in Washington. The now declassified 2018 Indo-Pacific Strategy, which is quite interesting, expresses the concern that China would try to divide US partners and allies. Yet instead, what we've seen is something very different. And I think the events of last year underline that, that in the midst of tensions with the US, you're seeing China take a harder line on issues like Taiwan, South China Sea, or even India. So it's worth asking if we should revisit some of those notions that we had from 4 years ago. I think the second interesting point is the degree to which Chinese experts in the media have explained the breakdown in India-China relations against the backdrop of the breakdown in China-US relations. There was this great interview with Liu Zhongyi of the Shanghai Institute of International Studies in September, which Hemant Adlaka of ICS had translated, and I recommend reading. And he's done a great service by translating that, which I think really captured the semi-official narrative in China explaining the breakdown in China-India relations. And a lot of it centered around India-US relations. So I think I would recommend reading all of it, but I would just flag a couple of points that he made, which was that he felt that the key to resolving the problem in China-India relations was for China to, quote, accurately determine its stance and have a better handle of what India and the US were doing. He felt that the reaction of the US to the boundary clash of 2020 underlined the fact that in his view, India and the US were gravitating towards, quote, a de facto alliance, even if it would never be acknowledged. And he called for this to reassess fundamentally China's understanding of this three-way dynamic. And I don't think that's going to change going forward, even with the new administration. Thirdly, the other interesting point has been a little bit of mirror imaging in India, viewing China as fundamentally voiding the boundary agreements that have kept the peace for the last 28 years or so. China has pretty much been accusing India of doing the same thing, which is violating another fundamental agreement, which was the, quote, position of the boundary question vis-a-vis the entire relationship. So what they have been focusing on is not China's aggression on the LAC, but India's economic measures, going back to withdrawal from RCEP negotiations, to the FDI amendments in April prior to the boundary clash, all of which is, in their view, suggesting that there was a partial aim at decoupling from India, which was in sync with what the US was doing. So in their view, that the main pressure, as Liu Zhongyi put it in his interview, was that the India and the US were presenting a joint challenge to China, which they had to respond to. And I don't think there's anything to suggest that that logic is going to change in the coming year ahead. I think I'll wrap up with those observations and hand it back to Ambassador Kant. Maybe we could get into the Q&A on some of those issues.
Thank you. Thank you. In fact, I'd unfortunately dropped out due to connectivity issues. So I missed part of your presentation. Just managed to return a few minutes ago. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. And the way you brought out, how China is looking at USA, illustrating with the comments given by various Chinese experts and commentators, and also implications that developments in US-China relations have for India-China relations. Thanks for that presentation. I'm sure there are a lot of questions as we move ahead. So we had two excellent presentations by Ambassador Arun Singh and by Ananth Krishnan. So now the floor is open for Q&A and discussion. We already have some people who have indicated their interest in asking questions. I'll request others to flag their interest either by raising hand, using the raise hand option, or by just indicating in the chat box. I'll begin by identifying three persons who have shown interest. One, Professor Hemant Adlakha, two, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, three, Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, in that order. Let me begin by asking Hemant to ask his question. Hemant?
Thank you, Ambassador Kantha. I'm sorry I'm not putting on my video because of very bad connectivity here. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Yeah, that's why actually I wrote my question and sent to the chat box. Anyway, basically, I wish to congratulate both the speakers and of course you for giving a very comprehensive introduction to the team. My question basically is comparing the two documents which have larger implications for the next 4 years under the Biden presidency, both for China-US relations and also for India, especially in the context of Indo-Pacific. And when we compare the just declassified SSFIP, that is the strategic framework for Indo-Pacific, and which was declassified on the 12th of January, and comparing it with the 2019 document which was released by or formulated by the Department of Defense, IPSR. I mean, there are a lot of conflicting points in the two documents, especially when we look at the focus on the Indo-Pacific and also therefore India. So just two conflicting points I pointed out in my question. One is between China and Russia, which was also referred to by Ambassador Arun Singh in passing. And the confusion this creates is that for the Biden administration, what is going to be the main challenge when it comes to foreign policy? Is it Russia or is it China? Because both the documents put emphasis on, one puts it on Russia and the other puts it on China. And the other conflicting point is on the India as the ally partner. The one document puts South Korea in the center as the allies in the Asia Pacific and relegates India to the other smaller countries along with South Asia. And I mean, I just would like to know your comments whether this conflicting focus is the result of the confusion in the so-called bipartisan view in the US, or is it the continuing rivalry between the two parties, which is going to have its major impact on the priorities between who will be calling the shots when it comes to foreign policy, White House or the Pentagon? Your comments, please.
Arun would like to respond.
Yeah, so I think let me respond on that. I think there is a general sense, both among Democrats and Republicans, that while both Russia and China are major challenges to the US, it is China which is the growing challenge. You may recall that in 2012, during the election at that time, when Mitt Romney, who was the Republican rival to President Obama, had said that Russia is the main strategic rival for the US. And President Obama in the campaign then said that Russia is a regional power. It is not a global power. And of course, once Russia was seen as having intervened in the 2016 election, there was some criticism of Obama at that time. But I think there is a general sense that Russia is certainly a military challenge. But in the wider US system, they see China as a broader systemic challenge today to what the US is attempting, because they see Russia's challenge, although Russia is active to some extent in West Asia, is active in Africa, they see Russia's challenge as focused largely on Europe. And they see growing European capacity to respond to that. But it is in the China's challenge, which is appearing in Latin America, appearing in Africa. It is appearing, of course, in Asia, and also in Europe directly, because China is reaching Europe through the Arctic, through cyber, through its ownership of ports and other infrastructure there. So they see China as the main global challenge to them, also in the economic and technological domain. And I think that is certainly going to condition the wider response. Second, when you spoke about whether it's India or ROK, look, I think in the US articulation, clearly ROK, Japan, Australia are at a different position because they are formal allies. So when they are looking at certain military postures, they would be describing these countries differently from what they describe India. And they see the convergence in the interest with India. They describe India as a major defense partner. There are more and more military exercises being done with India, because as US officials have pointed out, that the US does more military exercises today with India than with any other country outside the NATO framework. And so they look at the relationship with India in that context, and they also talk more and more of interoperability with India. But as far as a formal military alliance is concerned, clearly India is not what ROK, Japan, and Australia mean to the United States. So I think we should not really look at a country-specific competition in terms of how relationships are described or articulated. But I think there is a recognition in the US system that to effectively shape the environment around the rise China, they need to build a stronger partnership with a country of India's size and capacity. And the other countries in Asia will not quite provide the same capacity.
Just to add one small point to that, Hemant, I would point you to what the new Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, said in his hearings today. It's quite interesting. He was asked the question that you just asked us. And he said that he broadly agrees with the Trump administration's characterization of both China and Russia as rivals and their big challenges. But he said very clearly that, as I see it, China is the top priority, and he put it in black and white. I thought I'd flag that to your attention.
Thank you. Vishnu, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, would you like to ask your question now?
Thank you very much, Chair. Am I audible?
Yes.
All right. Arun and Ananth, thank you for wonderful insights that you have given. Arun, you mentioned you spoke briefly about the South China Sea and how Obama did not walk the talk. From either of the two speakers, do you have any comments or insights into why did Obama just wag the finger when Chinese took over the Scarborough Shoal? Because that was the turning point as far as I can see it. And after that, they went whole steam ahead. So what could have been the constraints? That's one. Two very quick, short questions. There were reports early on in April, May this last year that the US government had been funding some research at Wuhan lab on coronavirus. And then things quietened down. Is there anything more to that, or it was just a part of the conspiracy theory? Because apparently some experiments on bats, etc., were done. Lastly, there are reports that Trump's efforts to wean American companies out of China have failed, or decoupling has failed, and barely 17 to 18% of the American firms' factories are either leaving or planning to leave. Is that correct? Thank you.
Ashok, if I may start by responding to that.
Yeah. Yes.
So on, Vishnu, as we've discussed and as we all recognize, that every country takes action based on its own compulsion and interest. And therefore, the US response was based on how they saw their interest. And I think they assessed that given relative capacities, it was not in their interest to take on China frontally on that issue, and that their interest lay more in asserting freedom of navigation, in sort of reiterating their defense commitment to the Philippines, but not go beyond that and not take on China frontally, because that would have involved them in a different level of engagement. And they made the determination that didn't work for them. And that was similar in the case of Senkaku, similar response in the case of Chinese militarization. So I think that's a limit. We have to understand that despite the US being the preeminent global power, now being challenged by also by China, there are limits to what the US can do. And there are limits to what the US political and the military system is capable of achieving on any particular issue. On the Wuhan lab issue, I don't think there have been consistent follow-up reporting on that. But you may have also seen that there was a professor in Harvard, Charles Lindbergh, I think, who was arrested for cooperating with facilities in Wuhan, professor of chemistry, and without appropriate approvals from the US government. But in terms of the related to bats, I have not seen any consistent reporting that would see the issue through. In terms of the US companies, you're right. I think most US companies have assessed that despite the friction, despite the challenges, they're still in a position to make sufficient profits in China to stay on. In terms of reporting that I've seen, they have also got back to the administration to say that, look, it was the US government that encouraged all of us to get involved in China. And now we can't suddenly do a 180-degree turn, and there we have investments, we have stakes. But most of the companies are looking at China plus options, because they see that now there are enhanced risks in terms of continued engagement. And so they're looking at investment also elsewhere to balance out the risk. And I think because of this increased uncertainty, when they're looking at fresh investment proposals, they're not quite rushing into China the same way as they did before. At the same time, again, reports have indicated that the Chinese government is reaching out to the US companies to say that we will be helpful to you. We will be accommodating of your interests and concerns and continue remain engaged here. So that's the other thing. And in the phase 1 trade deal that Trump did in January last year, the Chinese gave concessions for financial companies in the US. And even as the administration has been pushing for some decoupling from China, companies based on Wall Street, the US financial companies, have been pushing for continued engagement. And the Chinese have tried to attract them in. And again, the investment agreement that Europe has done, part of the Chinese effort is to reach out to as many companies as they can, as the Chinese can, and show them that they continue to benefit from engagement with China. So their strategy would be certainly to divide between Europe and US, and in the US to divide different stakeholders. And I think a reference has been made to climate change, with somebody like former Secretary of State John Kerry being given a ministerial status, a seat at the National Security Council, and his mandate being climate change. He will certainly push for engagement with China on climate change issues as being an important reason for keeping the door open to China. So I think these different pulls and pressures will play out, and we'll have to administration navigates all this.
Thank you.
Ananth would like to add something?
Yes, on the decoupling issue, I think that there are two numbers that I saw in the last couple of days that I thought really showed how limited the Trump administration has been in its objectives. I think where it did succeed was in really dealing a blow to Chinese firms in terms of their access to US technology. But HSBC surveyed 1,100 global companies, 70% of which were American. And they found that 75% of them over the next 2 years plan to increase their supply chain footprint in China. So in terms of relocating supply chains, that really hasn't panned out. Neither has the trade deficit. The numbers that just came out recently put it at $317 billion in China's favor, which is higher than the $288 billion that it was at the end of the year one of the Trump administration. So after 4 years, it's actually increased.
Although, Ananth, the figure that I saw between 2019 and 2020 till November, January-November, there is a reduction of $37 billion in the trade deficit. That's the US US Census Bureau's figures. Just.
So yeah, I suppose we'll wait to see when their updated figures come out. But these, according to the Chinese figures, it was more or less the same, and there hasn't been really a big difference. The Wuhan lab is quite interesting. I think, as you said, there's been a history of, I think, US scientists have been cooperating with Chinese scientists in studying bad coronaviruses. I think my colleagues in the Hindu had this interesting story where they were even cooperating with an institute in Bangalore, where you had the Wuhan Institute, and American scientists and Indian scientists who were studying bad coronaviruses at some point of time in the Northeast. But that's a tangential thing. But what is interesting is I think the Trump administration has cut the funding for what was a NIH-supported research study into bad coronaviruses. But the US scientists have been quite critical of that. And I read a comment where they said that it's kind of like blaming a fireman for a fire, because they said that they've been studying these bad coronaviruses precisely because for the last 10 years, the scientific community felt that there was a pandemic that was going to come. And so that's why they were studying them. But now they say they're being blamed for it. So, but we never quite know. And I mean, you still can't rule out with any certainty whether or not this was the original source of this is something we'll never know, especially because China has been really guarded about opening up the Wuhan Institute. And I don't think they're going to open it up to the WHO team that's currently in Wuhan either.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we now request Ambassador Yogendra Kumar to ask this question? Yogendra?
Thank you. The statements made at the time of the confirmation hearing actually is not very much different from what the Trump officials did when they were actually doing their confirmation hearing. So I think we'll have to wait and see exactly how the policy unfolds as far as China is concerned. And the US, primary objective at the moment, of course, is coronavirus and to turbocharge the economy. And the Chinese have been a little clever in the sense that they have wrapped up Southeast Asia in RCEP and also wrapped up European Union in terms of the agreement. So my question actually here is that given, and of course the fact that at this particular moment, practically everybody's asking this question, to what extent the US leadership will be resolute enough to actually show that they are leaders in many respects. And my question here basically is this, that, in terms of the kind of situation that is unfolding, to what extent will the US have an appetite, for example, for a standoff in South China Sea? I mean, we know that late last year, there were, of course, some standoff which took place in South China Sea. There's one question, which is of interest to us. The second thing, of course, is that given the fact that, we are somewhat differently placed, to what extent does it open for us more options vis-a-vis Russia? In the sense that, there's also this question about the US taking a certain hard line on Russia. Thank you.
Arun would like to respond.
Yeah, in terms of the standoff, I think the Chinese at one level have the option to show some cooperation to the new administration to change the atmospherics around the relationship. And therefore, they can offer them some cooperation, let's say climate change, North Korea, some other issue, getting the global economy moving again, so it also benefits the US. That can be a peg to lower the temperature a bit and get some dialogues going. At the same time, historically, the Chinese have also tested incoming administrations. So you may recall that in 2001 was the EP-3 incident, when an American reconnaissance aircraft ended up having to land in Chinese territory, and 24 US airmen were kept there for a couple of weeks. In 2009, soon after the Obama administration came in, there was a near collision in the South China Sea. So they also do the testing to see, the dynamic and will of the new administration. So there could be some short-term orientations, short-term incidents, but I think the wider acceptance in the US system is that they are under a challenge, a long-term challenge from China, and they need to respond to that. And I think the relationship will be conditioned, keeping this in mind, and that's the message you get across the board. On Russia, President Trump himself clearly wanted to have a more cooperative relationship with Russia, but it was the US Congress and not just Democrats, but also Republicans, but also because of the push from Democrats who tied down his hands because of this argument and perception that Russia was involved in the 2016 electoral campaign. Joe Biden may not have the same sort of weakness that Trump had in terms of political criticism of a link with Russia, but there is a lot of anger in the Democratic Party about how they see Russia's approach, not just in the domestic US context, but also in Ukraine. And that will, put some pressure on Biden and others related to Kantha. You may have noticed that the Trump administration went ahead and sanctioned Turkey for purchase of S-400. They have now sanctioned a couple of Russian companies and vessels involved in construction of the Nord Stream 2 project in Germany related to Kantha. And we'll have to see how does the Biden administration handle Kantha requirement for our own S-400 purchase. So Biden would not be under the same pressure from the Congress, and we'll obviously have to make the argument that it is in US own interest not to signal in India that it is an unreliable partner and therefore it should not sanction India, recognizing India's historical linkages and national security interests. But that's something I think we'll have to see how it plays out.
Ananth would like to add something?
Nothing to add.
Okay. I'll now invite Professor Ananth Giri to ask his question.
Now, both of you have mainly taken a geopolitical position, but even in the height of anti-Soviet position in the US, there are different kind of people's movement. So my query is that the discourse so far has been limited to geopolitical construction of the political establishment. And there is no engagement with varieties of people's movement, because a growing US-China confrontation in the context of climate change and nuclear war is deeply implicated with varieties of concerns. So I would request your attention to the emerging and existent people's movement for dialogue and peace in the USA and also in China, however incipient it may be. My second query is that Ambassador Singh and also Ananth Krishnan, I think you referred to the genocidal characterization of Chinese policy vis-a-vis Xinjiang. But what is the implication of that? And also, if you would reflect upon the whole question of Tibet, and if there would be some change in the Biden administration vis-a-vis the Tibetan question. Thank you.
Arun would like to come in first.
Yeah, let me come in on that. So I think it's a very important point related to what's happening in the wider stakeholder community at the popular level, other movements, how they're getting involved. So far, we have not seen too much activism on that front related to China. The more effort for continued engagement with positive orientation is coming from institutions and organizations that are benefiting financially from the China linkage. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it's the universities, it's the businesses, it's the regions where China is heavily invested. And the Chinese have been very aggressive. They push companies, organizations, people to come out in support of China. The embassy reaches out, gives the diktat, demands certain things, or cuts down on the engagement. In fact, in the whole series of speeches that Pompeo did, not only did he, in fact, Massachusetts Institute of Technology refused to host Pompeo's speech directed at universities. And then he went to Georgia Tech and made the speech, and specifically mentioned that Massachusetts had refused to allow me to speak there. They called out the US National Basketball Association because they had criticized the manager of Houston Rockets for silencing one of their officials who had tweeted against Chinese action in Hong Kong. Pompeo also criticized Hollywood for refusing to be critical of Chinese policies in any of the kind of films that they're making, because there's heavy Chinese investment in the entertainment industry in the US. So that kind of action and pushback is happening. In terms of the characterization as genocide, it can open up for further sanctions from the US against Chinese officials involved, and it can lead to US activism in multilateral fora against China, because it's a very, very serious characterization. Of course, China has shown capacity to push back against that. In the Human Rights Council, for example, the US and 30 other countries came out with a statement criticizing Chinese practices in Xinjiang, but China generated support from 50 countries, including a large number of Islamic countries who were supportive of China on the issue. On Tibet, again, I think there is a growing demand in the US for being more proactive in terms of defending the cultural, other rights, human rights of the Tibetan people. But so far, I have seen that coming, outside the system, of course, but more from the US Congress rather than from the administration itself. Because Trump didn't meet the Dalai Lama, and Obama was also a little careful in handling that issue. And we'll have to see the manner in which Joe Biden decides to deal with this. But the US Congress has been pushing for that. And in the latest National Defense Authorization Act, they brought in a specific provision related to policy on Tibet, the kind of support US should provide, and that the US should not recognize any Dalai Lama that is not generated by the Tibetan community, but selected from Beijing. And I think the other thing we'll have to watch is on Taiwan, because on Taiwan, the Trump administration specifically has done far more than previous administration. He spoke to the president of Taiwan in December 2016, soon after he was elected, and the Chinese reacted very negatively to that. President Xi, after that, refused a call with Trump till he was prepared to say after the call that US stood by the earlier commitments related to Taiwan and China. And so once that was done, only then did he speak, and the Trump administration was a little careful. But towards the last phase, they have authorized high-level engagement. Cabinet Secretary has visited. They had authorized the PR in the UN to go to Taiwan, but that visit was cancelled. But Pompeo has formally authorized now higher level diplomatic and official engagement between US and Taiwan, and we'll have to see how the Biden administration deals with that.
Ananth would like to add something?
Sure. Briefly, as Ambassador Singh said, I think on Xinjiang, it will have some impact in the sense that this is the first government that's actually termed it a genocide. So it could lead to other governments coming out with stronger public statements on what's happening in Xinjiang, possibly only in Europe. I think it will keep in place all the trade restrictions that have been put in on companies that have any presence in Xinjiang, on imports that can be traced to Xinjiang. All of that will remain in place. And given that Biden has said on record as a candidate that he thinks it's genocide, it will be very strange for him to change that. And I think that will be here to stay. On the people's movements, I will just make a brief point where it's true that in the US, you have constituencies that have even publicly criticized the Trump administration. For instance, universities have come out at some restrictions on Chinese students. The business community can come out, but in China, you have to, I think, important to remember that there's no space for other constituencies to publicly come out and shape policy in the way they can in the US. Ultimately, the leadership sets the policy and everybody falls in line. So I would say that there's not much space for outside the state for influencing the relationship as far as China is concerned, would be my take.
Thanks. We have, in fact, run out of time, but I'll request Admiral Muralidharan and Ambassador Suresh Goyal to ask their questions and keep the questions very brief because we have run out of time. Admiral Muralidharan?
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador Ashok. My question is primarily to Ambassador Arun Singh. You know, I'm just looking at the basic policy of US over the long term from what you have listed. Now, they propped up China, and China has sort of, become the challenger, gone against them. Similarly, if you recall, to spite the Soviet Union, they propped up people like, which grew up into things like Taliban, which came back to haunt the US itself. So in the long term, does US really think long term, and do they have a policy? Can they be trusted? And my own question is also you mentioned Kissinger. In 71, he supported the Pakistan and the China, this thing. He spoke against us. But in his later book, 2014 book, which has also been quoted by some of our people, to say that he actually praised India's non-aligned policy in 2014 in his book, The Choices. So what is the dichotomy in the US thinking and the long term? Thank you.
Let's combine all the questions. So Suresh and then Prerna Gandhi. We'll conclude after that.
Thank you, Ashok.
And Suresh, just keep your question very brief.
Yes, I know. I was out of the room for about 5 minutes, and therefore I do not know if my question has already been answered by the two speakers. But briefly, what I wanted to know is that in terms of working out a relationship with China under the new administration, where do you think, primarily to Arun, where do you think will be the possible adjustments that would be coming from the US administration with China? And do you think Quad could be one of the areas where USA could change its policy or soften its policy? Thank you. I couldn't be briefer than that.
Thanks, Suresh. Thank you. I appreciate it. Prerna, will you unmute yourself and ask the question?
I think she has dropped out, Ashok. I don't see her in the...
Okay, I'll just read out her questions in the chat box. What would be the impact on Taiwan of the change of leadership in US? The removal of restrictions on political exchanges with Taiwanese officials has the potential to create a new momentum if Biden encourages. I think Arun has partly answered this question. So back to Arun and Ananth.
So I think the first question to Ashok was, does the US think long term? And my response is that the US thinks it is thinking long term. And, in my engagements in the US, I used to say that they have tremendous resources. They have huge bureaucratic organizations and capacities. They have large numbers of think tanks. They they study every issue in great detail. Many reports come out. If you look at, for example, various strategy reports that have come out or reports related to Indo-Pacific, whole series of things, including the administration. And yet, how is it that at the end of it, they make serious mistakes? I mean, look at what the support to Taliban, jihadi elements against the Soviet Union led to. It led to the Al-Qaeda attack. Their intervention in Iraq in 2003 didn't succeed at all. So I think while the US does examine and look at various issues, the final policy choices that are made based on political compulsions. And we have to factor that in. And that applies to every country. And therefore, the compulsions of that moment, what you need to do, that very often determine your policy. And it can have longer-term consequences that you ignore at that time, or you're not able to anticipate. And even a country with resources like the US does end up with that. And we've seen, for example, on their policy to China, something that they are acknowledging now. But at that time, they felt that in the global balance of power, it was important to get China on their side, to split it off from the Soviet Union. And after the end of the Cold War, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they felt that through engagement, they could condition the shape of China's rise, which would work in US interest. And it didn't work out that way. In terms of Suresh's question, I would feel that if China is able to give some cooperation to the US in areas that matter to it, like climate change, or let's say North Korea, the US may relax a bit on economic and technology access issues. But I don't think they're going to relax or go back on, for example, the Quad or the Indo-Pacific. In fact, there was a lot of speculation going on whether the US would not pursue these policies as energetically as the Trump administration had done. But if you saw the comments, not just before the campaign, but also during the hearing yesterday, the Indo-Pacific was mentioned repeatedly as an important framework for cooperation, and support to the Quad and strategic cooperation, defense cooperation, also in the framework of the Quad, was specifically articulated by the incoming defense secretary. So I don't see any give on that. Again, I think on Taiwan, I would believe that the effort on the part of the Biden administration would be to avoid the kind of provocation on this issue that the Trump administration has done. And if without sort of being seen as going back, if they can find a way of not pursuing actively the space that Pompeo has opened through his decision, they would probably not want to use this as a provocation for China.
Ananth?
Nothing to add, Ambassador Khan, to Ambassador Singh's detailed reply.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we will conclude now. We have already run out of time, so I will not try to sum up a very rich discussion we had. Let me join other colleagues in thanking and congratulating the two speakers for excellent work they did. Both Arun and Ananth, their presentations were really remarkable, very insightful, and we have a much better understanding of dynamics of US-China relations under Biden administration. One thing comes across from presentations and remarks made by Ambassador Arun Singh and Ananth Krishnan, that one may expect a fairly large measure of continuity when it comes to Sino-US relations. In the recent past, this relationship has been characterized by strategic contention. That element of rivalry will not go away. There might be greater effort made by the Biden administration to explore areas of convergence on issues like pandemic or climate change or global economic issues that might lead to USA and China working together on specific issues that might lead to a style of diplomacy which is little less confrontational, a little more predictable. But the basic dynamics of this relationship, to my mind, is unlikely to change anytime soon. So thank you very much for the presentation. Let me thank the two speakers again and thank all of you for joining us in this discussion. This is a dialogue which will continue because it's a relationship which has very major implications for us in terms of our national interests, in terms of our own relations, India's relations with both the USA and China. So we'll continue this dialogue in future seminars of Institute of Chinese Studies. Thank you very much.